Hey, welcome along. It's good to see you again. I hope you're not melting away. I'm melting. That was the movie for last week, wasn't it? There you go. Wizard of Oz. There you go. Tie-in. See, we all ties in. God didn't have to organise the hot weather, though. Welcome along. It's Tuesday evening. For those who may not know, I'm Richard Moores, Children's, Youth and Families Pastor for Southside Uniting Church. Every Tuesday we get together and we talk a bit about ministry with young people and broader things, obviously. What we're looking at is a bit broader. So, welcome along. Some of you might tune in live, some of you might watch later, some of you might be seeing this on YouTube. Welcome wherever you are and whenever you are. I want to take a moment to recognise that we meet on land that God has created. And for Southside, that land God entrusted to the Yaga and the Turrbal people. So we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And we pray for reconciliation between us and First Peoples of this land and between God and all peoples. So welcome along. So as I said last week, the movie was The Wizard of Oz. So every week I give you a quote from a movie. If you know what movie it comes from, pop it in the comment section and you could win a prize. Reminds me, I still owe Peter Choi and the other person one. Who was the other person that got one? Sue Berry. I haven't forgotten. If those two are tuning in, I haven't forgotten you. I've just got to remember to have the bit of chocolate in my hand when I see you next. But that's all right. So, movie quote for this week. I'll have what she's having. There you go. What movie does that come from? I'll have what she's having. Comes from a movie. Which one is it? See if you can work out. So, as you can see by the title, wherever it is, this is part 2. So, I'm saying so a lot, aren't I? What's that? I nearly said it again. I think it started November. Started doing a course, auditing it through UTC, United Theological College in Sydney, led by Chris Button, who I know from Newcastle days, but who spent some time as, I think he was resource person for the United Aboriginal and Isla Christian Congress, which is the First Peoples arm of the Uniting Church, in a sense. And so saw the title and went, that would be great to do. So I did that, and so over the holidays, lots and lots of reading. My problem, people say BA students do nothing. I did a BA, and it seems like nothing except when you're a really slow reader. When you're a slow reader, it takes a lot of time. So, yeah. Kylie and her family would go out for a few hours, come back. Oh, how did you go? It's like, well, I got 1 week's readings done. But that's all right. Sorry, I'm just looking at Doctor Who books. Anyway, so last week we started and we looked at how the statement from the heart reflected the need for us to start to talk about reconciliation. We talked about the colonial context that the history is that, and we are in a colonial environment that's still Europe, England rules over us and the Queen, and the structure that we have is a colonial Western structure over our First Peoples. And then in some ways that needs to change. We talked a bit about the missionary context, that sometimes that went well, often it didn't. But where it went well, the First Peoples were allowed to continue in their culture and their language and things like that. We talked a bit about, reflected on Indigenous people and the church, and that sense that too often we've gone, or we know all the faith stuff, and they don't. And I linked it back to the Andy Root, Charles Taylor, they're at secular 0, we're at secular 1, so we must be better than them, so we've got to teach them how to know God properly. Well, no, we've got a whole heap of stuff we can learn from them, and sadly, too often it's been about, well, if First People want to be part of the church, they have to be part of the Western form of church, as opposed to finding what is the Aboriginal form. but there have been elements of Christianity put into corroborees and stuff like that that is starting to do that, which is good because that's what the early church did. We took pagan festivals and we made them Christmas. Not because we went, hey, we believe this stuff that pagans did, but we went, hey, you're looking at this festival of light. This is how God speaks into that. And so, for First Peoples, you're looking at how the world was created. Here's how God speaks into that creation. Things like that. We talked a bit about public and contextual theology. That fact that we need to understand what is the context that we're in when we want to do theology. What is the story that we're basing ourselves amidst, and how does that affect how we do theology? So as we look at how we view the land, how do we have a theology of land? Well, for Westerners, we control the land. That our view of land, our view of possession, impacts our theology on the land. For First Peoples, a connection of land, they have would have a very different theology of land. And so we need to understand what is the context we're coming with, what are some of the other contexts that are out there, and how might our theology need to change and adapt. So that was the first 5 weeks of my course. Week 6, we looked at the theological roots of reconciliation. So a guy called Schreiter, and it's actually how Chris pronounced his name, talks about reconciliation is first and foremost the work of God, and we cooperate in God's work. Only God can bring genuine reconciliation. So as we seek reconciliation between us and First Peoples, it's not just about, this is what we're going to do, but it's about how is God acting. So I'm just adjusting my camera so I can sit back a bit. What is our part in this and connecting with what God is doing? It's not just about us. We'll go through a bit more of this and then I'll reflect what my thoughts on this one was that I shared with Chris. Number 2, God begins the process by healing the victim. So God looks out for the marginalised and the victims. That's what we see Jesus do. He looks out for those that are on the outside and he heals them. And doctor goes to the sick, not the well. Very badly quoting Jesus. And that for repentance to happen can need actions of the victim to open space for repentance. So sometimes we need the victim to go, okay, I'm going to allow you a space where you can repent of what you've done. And that's part of the hard thing sometimes of reconciliation, the role that the poor victim has to play in order to do that. But God is there working. Number 3, reconciliation makes of both victim and wrongdoer a new creation. So it's not about, reconciliation with First Peoples is not about we come along and say, we're sorry for what happened in the past. Boom, let's continue with what we're doing. We need to change in some way. There needs to be alteration in us as well as in the First Peoples. We will both become new creations. We will head off in a new direction. Not just, hey, tick on how the world is now. So it doesn't just return to the status quo, but takes to a new place, often not imagined by others. So we might not see where we're going to head, but we need reconciliation and it's going to take us somewhere. We don't know where that is, but it needs to be somewhere other than where we're at now. Number 4, the pattern of healing and redemption from suffering is patterned on the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So we're going to go through that pain that we see Jesus go through in order to get to reconciliation. And number 5, reconciliation will only be completed when God has reconciled the whole universe to himself. And we'll never fully get there. We can take steps, we can make it much better, but we're never really going to be fully reconciled with First Peoples until kingdom come. But that is not to stop reconciliation. We can get a whole long way, we just might not get, trying to find where the thing, we might get a whole long way, we just might not get quite to the end. It's not working, is it? Anyway. So we need to work on this. We need to be thinking about how is God helping us to do this. Schreiter points out that memories of traumatic events can stop us from moving forward. And healing does not mean forgetting or invalidating, but giving space for change to come. So we don't go, hey, all that stuff that the early settlers did, bad, let's forget about it. Let's start again. We need to acknowledge it. We need to allow space for healing for the first peoples. And for us, but particularly for them. So, Schreider talking about that sense of reconciliation is an active thing. We need to be involved in it. It needs to be changing all of us. Langmead, as Schreider argues, reconciliation without justice is false reconciliation because it tries to ignore the suffering of the oppressed. It tries to bury history without dealing with it, rather than forgiving and forgetting. What is actually required is in social and national reconciliation is to remember history, telling the truth, working through the pain and, where possible, repairing the damage and restoring relationships. So reconciliation needs to be more than just, again, tick and forget, but it needs to be working through hearing those stories of the first people. What happened? What was that like for your people? What was the stolen generation like for you? What has the stuff that's been happening with families being taken and control, even in recent times? How does that affect? What are the stories? What are the pains? What are the hurt? How do we hear that? And as we hear that, we can move towards reconciliation. Langmead points out that Christian conversion can be seen as reconciliation in three dimensions: reconciliation with God, reconciliation with ourselves, and reconciliation with others. So obviously our reconciliation with the first peoples goes in that others bracket. And Langmead points out the church struggles to focus on reconciliation in mission when we are so divided within ourselves. So we're so busy worrying about the things that we disagree with ourselves that we can't actually go, well, how do we have reconciliation with those around us, and particularly first peoples? How do I keep our property and when we are splitting or whatever, instead of how do I acknowledge the place that first peoples have in this land? All those sorts of things. So reconciliation is our goal, and reconciliation is going to mean change. It's going to mean that we need to alter. It's not just we stick with the status quo, but we change and we alter. And so we need to so it's not, it's not making the first peoples like us. Hey, forgive us, come into our system. But it's about how do we change our system? How do we change, in some ways, their system so they can becomes a system where we can all live together, work together. We need to admit our history. And I think it was later that I talk about this. But I guess as reflecting on that reconciliation, and reconciliation starts as God's work. And I think this is where sometimes, I guess myself, this is where myself and I imagine others struggle with the idea that we see in the Bible of reconciliation and putting that into first people's reconciliation. So when we look at reconciliation in the Bible, what's happening? Well, we are the sinners and we are reconciled with God. How are we reconciled with God? Well, Jesus dies and pays the penalty for us and God accepts us back. What do? We do nothing to earn that reconciliation. So we, the ones who have caused the pain, do nothing while the one who has been hurt does all the work. And I think, sadly, sometimes we flick that idea into reconciliation with first peoples. And so that sense of, well, we've done all the pain, we'll say sorry, and first people have to do all the work to accept who we are and accept our systems and to become part of us. Because that's the model, isn't it? We say sorry, you just forgiven, we are forgiven and we are reconciled. Well, no, we're just very lucky that that's the way God does it, because God is a wonderful, loving God. And so for us to be reconciled, there needs to be change within us. There needs to be change in our country for reconciliation with First Peoples to really happen. Didn't know you were getting a lecture, did you? Hopefully you did. That was week 6. Week 7. What reconciliation means theologically. So thinking about how helpful is the analysis of the limits of political reconciliation for understanding government action in Australia about reconciliation, and what might be the implications for political reconciliation. So Strakosch talks about that idea that two different politics cannot really exist. So eventually the settlers take out the Indigenous people. So the colonisers will go into discussions, but they'll be dealing with the problems which the colonisers see. So we go into reconciliation and go, oh, well, how do we solve? Oh, well, how do we do reconciliations? Oh, we took children, so the stolen generation, we'll say sorry for that. There we go, reconciliation, tick, done. And as I think I said before, Kevin Rudd, the great apology. But in part of that apology, he says, and this ends that period of history. Well, no, it doesn't. The pain of that still carries on. We haven't dealt with that just by saying, oh, sorry. Oh, look, we're sorry. Did the wrong thing. Messed up. Forgot. There needs to be more than that. And so the problem is the colonizer comes and deals with the issues that they see and deals in the way that they want. And so the current discussions when Strakosch was writing, the aim was at moving on from colonial past to a post-colonial situation. And this aims at forgiveness for invasion by the Indigenous people and the consent to continued occupation so that business can go on as normal. So that's the problem. And in a sense, Strakosch talks about, as much as possible, the colonizer will try and ignore and get rid of the First Peoples. And sadly, that's what we see. We have these discussions and it becomes, how do we marginalise the First Peoples? Oh, they're just out there. They're a minority. They're not important. And it all becomes about us, the colonisers, instead of going, how do we hear the story of the First Peoples? And so in Australia, we have tended to deal with the settler Indigenous issue through policies. We make a policy to deal with how we deal with the First Peoples. We don't go into a relationship, we make a new policy. They're having problems, we'll make a policy that'll make things better. The Howard government rejected suggestions from the Reconciliation Commission because they would lead to further uncertainty rather than solving the problem now. Isn't that great? Oh, there's a problem. And there's all these recommendations. If we do that, they might be unsettling. We want something that'll fix it like that. Well, nothing's going to fix it like that. And if you don't go through the long journey, then the healing that needs to happen for the hurts never happens, and there is always instability. And we always go, well, we never really own this land, as much as we like to think we do. So Strakosch says, but to be part of this mutual imagination, we as settlers must first give up the fundamental desire to attach these futures to the project of legitimising our current privileges once and for all. So reconciliation, I said it a couple of times now, reconciliation cannot be about justifying, hey, we continue to do the occupation of the land. We continue to control the land as we always have. We continue to have the same structure we always have. There needs to be change. If it's just that structure, it's not true reconciliation. Schapp, the other reading, talked about it's assumed that an adequate recognition of the other's true identity will bring about reconciliation. So we go, we know the First Peoples. Let's talk about the First Peoples. That'll bring about reconciliation. Well, it needs to be more than that. We will only get true reconciliation when we stop using force to impose our truth on the other. How do we hear their truth? Instead of going, well, this is the history. We've written history books. Remember, history books are written by the winners. How do we hear the real histories? How do we hear the stories? A colleague of mine from New South Wales on Australia Day put up a post, and just talking about the honest that day. He remembers the sad history, and it just had a list of massacres of Aboriginal people, and you just scroll through and scroll through and scroll through, and you realise there is a whole heap of stuff that we just never learn about. We might hear of one or two, the Mile Creek Massacre or stuff like that, but there is just numbers and numbers of massacres. And until we admit that history, until we own that history, we're never going to get anywhere. Because we can't just sweep it on, oh, that didn't happen. It did happen. How do we deal with that? So we need to understand the political way that reconciliation normally happens and go, we need to fight against this. This is not about legitimising the Western imperialism. But this is about hearing both sides, hearing the stories, particularly of our first peoples, so that we can move forward. And so that real healing can happen. Here we go. 10 minutes. Week 10, reconciliation or reparation. Which paradigm? So I looked at Stanford University, talking about changes brought on by reconciliation can be changes to institutional structures, changes to external behaviour. So we might stop being... so changes in structural structure, like police reform, so that, Aboriginal people are treated more fairly. It's sad when you look at the statistics of the number of Indigenous people as a percentage in the prisons. It's far higher than the actual percentage of Indigenous people, not because they're bad, but because of the structures that we put in place. Changes to external behaviour, so cessation of aggression, that we can start to function close to the other. It's not always, over them, over there, but hey, we can actually do stuff together. Change in belief, that is that the other will change the idea that the other is some way evil, and accepting the past wrongs. And number 4, resolving negative emotions and attitudes. So accepting that what can't be changed, and overcoming resentment and dealing with grief, guilt. So some things, we can't change it. It's happened. Well, the structure's there. We'll try and change it, but some things just can't. We need to work through and deal with the resentment that comes from others, and maybe some of our guilt, and go, well, we need to move forward. We can't just sit here paralysed by guilt. Oh, we stuffed up. Yeah, we did. We need to move forward. So you need to state which relationship is being reconciled. And so they use the example that, in some cases, you might have various relationships with someone. And so which one are you working on? So their example was, you work with a friend, and maybe the friendship relationship is different to the working relationship. So I can fix our working relationship, but that might not fix our friendship. I can fix our friendship, but that might not mean we work well together. They mean different things. Some suggest that, Heather Griffin would be one of these, that sense of we're not working towards reconciliation, we're working towards conciliation. That perhaps there never really was any good relationships between Europeans and Aboriginals, and so we're not reconciling coming back together. We're actually trying to just come together to move to somewhere good. Others would say, it's still reconciliation, even if there was nothing good. And so the Stanford talks about different parts of that reconciliation that can happen. And so there can be apologies. The acknowledgement of the fact of the wrongdoing and the responsibility of the wrongdoer, as well as an expression of regret and remorse. So, and we've seen a number of apologies we've seen the apology from Kevin Rudd, we've seen apologies from churches. It doesn't mean there's not more things for us to apologise, and so there is a place for apologies. It's not the only thing we do, but there is definitely a place for, we need to apologise. Again, if it's the only thing we do, well, no. We might have memorials. So these might be statues, preserved sites of traumatic events, museums, archives, ceremonies, or educational activities. So the memorial can help to keep the memory of the past event to counter any who deny it. So What? What, you think there were no massacres? Well, let me take you to this site and see that statue. That reminds us of the massacre that happened here. This is part of our history. This can help to bring a common narrative of the event. So we can share this story, share this same story. We're not going, oh, different stories. It can show acknowledgement by the wrongdoer and commitment never to do that again. So we're putting this here. It's like God and the rainbow. I'm putting the rainbow in the sky, so I say I will never flood the earth again. And for the injured person, it can give self-respect and see them as a people. It's like, hey, they've recognised what they've done to us. And there's this thing that recognises we are a hurt people. On the other hand, it can draw attention away from ongoing problems or be a rallying point. So memorials can be good, can help to bring things together, can also be that, that keeps reminding us of these things from the past. Truth-telling is another way we can deal with things. And this can give details to those injured that otherwise might not be known. So we get to hear those stories, hear what really happened. Can counter certain denials, can be helpful to teach future generations not to repeat the past. But there are negatives of how can they hear the truth but not act. So, do I give an amnesty? And this was some of the struggles, I believe, in South Africa, where they had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where people could go and talk about, this is what I did to black people, and I'm sorry, but I don't get, there's an amnesty. I come and talk here, so nothing can happen. And there's also a sense of, as we open up that truth-telling and allow First Peoples to tell their stories, is there pain and hurt that actually re-injures them, that hurts them to tell that story again, or tell that story to us. So we might do some truth-telling. There might be amnesties. Again, controversial, could be groups or individuals, and that struggle. Could that inadvertently send the message that the abusers were not wrong, or that the injured did not deserve better? So, we let you off. Does that mean that it wasn't as bad as we thought it was? So, amnesties can be helpful to enable truth-telling, but can also send some other messages. Trials and punishment, on the other hand. No amnesty, we're going to put on trial those that did the wrong things. The power of punishment can put to rest, can put the past to rest, but trials show official disapproval of the action taking place. So, you're actually saying, no, this was wrong, from a political government level. But some argue that does not lead to reconciliation. And often the aim is showing guilt as opposed to truth-telling. We want to show that this person did the wrong thing, as opposed to what was the truth of what happened in this space. Then an amnesty and truth-telling might happen as opposed to court and trial, and we just want to show that you are bad. And that doesn't necessarily lead to reconciliation, it leads to punishment. Those that hurt might feel good about themselves, might feel vindicated, but is there reconciliation? Lustration, this is the investigation of people running for political office or media. So in that sense, as people go to these, is there anything in the past that makes them invalid? Hang on, they've been involved in mistreating First Peoples, can't be run for government or whatever. Reparations. So broadly, it is the work to repair the harm done by wrongdoers. Could be giving land, goods, money to replace those taken. The issue with this is, well, who do you give the money to? Or who do you give the goods to? Can be. There's also the concern that receiving money means all is forgiven, or that those lost can be replaced by money. So, well, hang on, we'd like some reparations, but that doesn't mean that, that person didn't matter because you give me $10,000. Or that this land doesn't matter to me because it's that tension. But reparations can help. Forgiveness. There's a lot of argument over the connection of forgiveness and reconciliation. Can there be reconciliation where one won't forgive? An interesting question some asked. The question might be, how much is given up in forgiveness? Can they forgive but still call for justice? I forgive you, but I want some justice out of this. but obviously, presumably has a big part in reconciliation. And participation in deliberative processes. So how do we help First Peoples to be part of the decision making? So there's a whole bunch of things that we can do that might move us towards reconciliation, and you might not do all of them. You might pick out some of those, and some of those in different places. And how do we allow our First Peoples to be part of the decision making of which of those do we use? Which of those are going to be meaningful for them and for reconciliation? We're going to stop there. It's 7:30. Thank you for joining us. Still got more, so we'll have part 3 next week. But hopefully this is getting you excited, getting you thinking about what does reconciliation mean and how do we keep moving towards reconciliation, which actually means a change. Not just endorsing what we've done, but a change for us and for First Peoples. Let us continue to pray for that. Let us continue to seek that. And I will see you again next Tuesday, if not before. Bye, everyone.